All right, welcome. And with that, so I'll get started. My name is Mags Bell. I am the program director for health professionals for a healthy climate. And at HPHC, as I think most folks know, but maybe a couple of you don't, we are an organization that comes together to activate and inspire health professionals to address climate change. And that's through advocacy as well as in education and in their clinical practices. And we have a couple of HPHC folks here, Kathleen Schuler and Alex Kim from our executive committee who are joining us. And for anyone who's here, if you want to, in the chat, introduce yourself and say more, please go for it. But other than that, I'm just going to dive in. And we're lucky today we have folks who are going to tell us about the Frontline Communities Protection Act, which I'm really excited about, and I'm excited to learn about and have this out there so that people can be learning about it. And so before we get right into that, and I will spotlight the speakers as they come up. I don't like to spotlight myself as much. I just do want to make a note. I'm personally a bit weary in general of just like reading land acknowledgements, like we're checking off a box on a to-do list. And also I believe it would be remiss not to acknowledge that the subject that we're talking about tonight really directly connects to many struggles across the state, including those that are being led and fought by our Indigenous friends and family and neighbors and community. And so if all of us, like myself, are in what's currently called Minnesota, then we are on stolen Anishinaabe and Dakota land. And whether in rural or urban spaces, people of both Anishinaabe and Dakota, as well as many Indigenous peoples, continue to be a part of our communities and our work and are the rightful stewards of this land. And I think it is worth taking a moment to acknowledge that. So yeah, I thank you all for being here. Real fast, I'm going to turn it over to Kathleen Schuler, who is the policy director for HPHC, who's going to give a brief update, and then we'll jump into learning about the bill.
Thanks, Megs. So I'm going to give a really, really quick overview of the legislative policies that we're following. The Frontline Communities Protection Act is one of them, so you're going to hear about that. We just had a hearing today. We're also following the Next Generation Climate Act, which is the bill that will update Minnesota's climate goals. So the Next Generation Energy Act was passed in 2007, and the goal was to reach 80% carbon-free by 2050. And we know we need to update that goal to prevent the worst effects of climate change, according to the IPCC. So that bill is actually being heard this evening in the House Environment Committee. So hopefully that will get through. We're also following a couple of bills to create a fund for state match for the Department of Commerce and other agencies to access the IIJA and the IRA money to be able to offer to compete for some of the grants that are out there, and also to provide technical assistance and grants for nonprofits and communities and others, and local government as well, to access some of those federal funding for climate action, basically. The other bill that was heard, and are you familiar with the NEVI program? It's a federal program, National Electric Vehicle Program. And Minnesota can access $68 million in funding to build out a fast charger network across the state. And that bill went through at least one committee. Representative Kraft is the author in the House. So this would create an electric vehicle infrastructure program in Minnesota, which we really need, and will help us access the $68 million in funding. There's also another bill. We're really supporting funding for electric school buses. And here's a bill that basically it's not funding, but it allows the utilities to create an electric school bus program, and it's HF 2502. I don't know if that's had a hearing yet. And the last bill that I will mention is Senate File 2584 to create a clean transportation standard here in Minnesota. It's really a low carbon fuel standard, and that's a bill that we don't support because it basically continues reliance on liquid fuels and the harm that ethanol provides. And we feel like we need to invest in getting to electrification faster rather than creating a bureaucratic state program that will keep ethanol in the mix for decades. So maybe we'll have a climate convo on that one. So that's a real quick highlight on some of the stuff that we're following. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. Really appreciate the update. There's a lot going on. Yeah, so really appreciate kind of the quick download, and that's great to share, and especially the work that we've been doing on the low carbon fuel standard, or whatever they're calling it, Bill. And with that, I would love to turn it over to focus on the bill that we are here to talk about today. And so we have, and I'm gonna just spotlight y'all. We have Tim and Sasha with us, and Sasha is the environmental health and justice organizer for Clean Water Action, and Tim is the legal advocate at Copal, Minnesota, and both have been actively working on this bill. And so I turn it over to the two of you to educate us on what the goal is, tell us all about it, et cetera, et cetera. So thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks, Max. Kind of looks like we should be debating right now, but we're not going to. So. I mean, we could, but that's not the intent. Yeah, as you said, Max, I'm Tim Schaefer. I'm the legal advocate at Copal, so I work at both our worker center and with the environmental justice team. I've been working on this proposed law for a little over a year now, although I was part of the coalition a little bit in my past job. So I've been like keeping an eye on this legislation for a while. I've really only learned more about how it came to be during my time at Copal, which is something I think we should talk about. It's been something that folks have worked on for a long time and in different iterations. So I'm happy to talk a little bit about that too, because I think it's really important context, and it's also part of several ongoing fights that are happening throughout Minnesota. So Sasha, if you want to say hi too.
Yeah, sure. Hey, everyone. Yeah, I'm Sasha, you see him pronouns. I've been involved in this effort for around 2 years now in my role with Clean Water Action. It's mostly been in the last year and a half or so that I've been part of the leadership circle as well, and have been more involved in helping to craft the language and move the strategy forward, and advocate and lobby for the bill as well. So yeah, this bill has, like Tim said, this bill and this issue has a long history, both in Minnesota and in plenty of other places. And it's really exciting to see how much progress we've made on all of that, and how much just energy there is to pass this bill this session. So I'm really hopeful that we can get a strong bill passed. I don't know, Tim, do you want to start with like some of the background? You want me to kick it off?
No, I can do that. That sounds good. And like I said, this is context I didn't have really until I started doing this work recently. And I think it's really important to center it because this wouldn't happen without it. So my understanding is there's kind of two different relevant histories to the bill in Minnesota. One of which is Roxanne O'Brien and CMEJ, which is a local environmental justice organization. She was a big part of the fight to get rid of Northern Metals, and also is a huge part of the fight to shut down the Herc waste incinerator in downtown Minneapolis. And she, in conversation with Representative Fu Lee, brought this idea of like addressing the cumulative impacts of pollution as a part of the permitting process. And then my coworker, Ryan Perez, also worked on a cumulative impacts bill when he was back, I think, at the Land Stewardship Project. And that was more based on requiring proposed legislation to have a cumulative impacts analysis attached to it. And so I think, like, more broadly speaking, folks have come to the conclusion that we need to actually address the way permitting happens, with the way environmental regulations are implemented in Minnesota. And it needs to be a substantive change, not just something that is a part of the legislative process. Although I think that would be good too. That's not to dismiss that idea. It's just to say that we're more focused on the substance of the permitting process right now. And Sasha, maybe that's a good time for you to kind of talk about what we're doing and why.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, this is also kind of an expansion on a law that was passed in 2008 by former State Representative Karen Clark, who really brought this idea to Minnesota and, made Minnesota a leader in addressing cumulative impacts in that regulatory process. And so, yeah, our goal with this bill is to provide significantly increased protections for communities that have been historically marginalized. And so it starts by defining what is an environmental justice community. And I think there are a number of really good conversations to have around, like, how are we actually defining that? Our current definition is just that if a community is either 40% or more BIPOC, 35% or more low income, or 40% or more lower English proficiency, or if it is one of the federally recognized tribal communities, then it is an environmental justice community. And with the current language of the bill, if a permit is, if a facility is trying to get a new permit or expand on a current permit in an EJ community, it would have to undergo a cumulative impacts analysis, and that analysis would determine whether or not they would be able to get that permit. And this is the overall goal of this bill, again, is to ensure that these communities have significantly stronger protections, because there is such a long history of systemic oppression in the form of a regulatory system that has concentrated these facilities in low-income communities and BIPOC communities and Indigenous communities. And so this ensures that it is much harder to get a permit for especially medium and larger facilities in those communities. And in order to even get those permits, there would have to be some pretty significant, both just in general community benefits, like benefits to the community that would be impacted by that pollution, and community support for that. And so that ensures that we can shift the power back to the communities that have for so long not had that power, and provide them the agency to say, we don't want this facility in our community, or we do want this facility in our community. And this language has gone through many iterations. The bill was, I believe, initially introduced 3 or 4 years ago, if not longer back. And since then, the people who have been working on it has changed, and the goals have shifted some in some ways. But especially over the last year, we have been in conversation with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, since they would be the agency that would be implementing this bill, to talk through what are their concerns, what are their desires. They are interested in pushing a cumulative impacts bill as well, but they are coming from a very different perspective on how it should function. And so over the last year, we've been working to really push them to have a stronger position on this, and to try and get them to be closer to where our language is at, while also trying to figure out what are their concerns with our language, that since they would be the ones who are implementing it. So our overall goal has been to find language that is, both very strong and effective at, protecting our overburdened communities, and also feasible for implementation, because it is a lot easier to, get rid of a law, or to, stop a bill from getting passed if the ones who would actually be implementing it are saying that it isn't viable. Tim, I don't know if you want to talk more about kind of where it's currently at in the process.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. So we had our first hearing, and I don't want to gloss over the substance of the bill, because we'll have time to talk more about that. I will say that the bill itself is more setting sort of definitions and standards for what the process will look like, and we'll be fleshing out the process more once it's passed, which is going to be a really important time to bring in health professionals and folks who can, I won't say objectively, because that's kind of a loaded term, but can identify the most important stressors in these EJ areas, because that's something that is likely to be substantively done through rulemaking. So I just want to say that before I move on to where it's at in the process. But right now, so we have had the bill heard in both the Senate and the House. We had a bit more time to talk about the bill today, but in both cases, the goal was to have the bill laid over for inclusion in an omnibus bill. That is a horrible phrase. That basically means that the bill doesn't get a formal vote, but it's set aside so that it can be included for consideration in an omnibus bill. And we want to have the language substantively similar in both houses. We've kept it as strong as possible. As Sasha said, there's been a couple changes to, I'm not going to say details, but aspects of the bill that we are, willing to negotiate on, I guess, to be blunt. But I will say also, I think as part of this process, what's been really important to me is that we've brought this language back to folks like Roxanne and like Karen Clark and talked to them and said, like, does this look like what you want? And if not, how would you make it stronger? I think that's been important to sort of prevent ourselves from just getting into like a lobbying mindset where we're just passing something to pass something. And I mean, anyone can fall victim to that, because when you've worked on something and put an effort into writing language, it's easy to feel protective of it. But like, I think this has been a very collaborative process, and one that has made it easier for us to move like carefully and thoughtfully. So yeah, I think that's important to note too, is it's not just been a lobbying process, it's been a process of like building trust between different people and, stopping and talking through things when we disagree and coming to consensus, which is never easy, but I think it builds like a much stronger final product. So yeah, just wanted to make sure I talked about that a little bit.
And I can touch a bit on also just like very specifically the overall like path that it takes through the legislature, because yeah, like Tim said, it's a wonky process, and one that is pretty intentionally made hard to engage with and understand. So yeah, like Tim said, our ultimate goal is to have it included in the House and Senate Environment Omnibus bills, which, if anyone is not very familiar with that, a lot of committees will create very large bills that incorporate a ton of different things that they, don't necessarily want to go through the entire process. And at the end of session, they will, work on passing these really large omnibus bills, which can include a ton of different priorities. And it is one way to kind of avoid having to have like a floor vote in the House and Senate on a single bill, which can endanger some bills, because there are a number of legislators who don't like to vote on a specific thing, but might vote in favor of an omnibus bill that contains like other things that they think are good. And so on the Senate side, we were hoping that it would just be laid over immediately, but we did learn that there is a rule there that it has to go to the Senate State and Local Government Committee, and then be re-referred back to this the Environment, Climate, and Legacy Committee. We believe that it'll have a pretty easy path getting through the other committee. It's mostly just a formality because the bill does have some rulemaking. And so once it gets re-referred back to the Environment, Climate, and Legacy Committee, there will be another hearing there, and then it'll be laid over for possible inclusion. Whereas on the House side, it doesn't have that technicality. So the hearing that we had today, like Tim said, we had a great number of testifiers who spoke in support, and there were some great comments in support as well from some of the other legislators on that committee, and the bill was just laid over for inclusion. And so at this point, the main thing is finalizing the language that we can ideally all agree upon and that PCA can agree to, and then making sure that there is enough social and political pressure to not take the bill out of the omnibus bill, because that is something that can happen, especially because when they are negotiating between the House and the Senate versions, they create conference committees, which is representatives of the different of the House and the Senate committees, who basically behind closed doors decide what remains in the final product of the omnibus bill. And if there are concerns, or if there has been lobbying from like business industry or other outside forces on certain legislators that are in conference committee, it is possible that the language on cumulative impacts could be taken out. But we believe that we've heard really strong support from the chairs of the different committees on the House and Senate. We have some great champions in Representative Lee and others who have been really pushing this forward. And we feel that there are not many other barriers to getting a very strong cumulative impacts bill passed this session. Tim, I don't know, are there other parts of the bill that you feel like we should outline, just like in terms of the function? I know I gave a brief overview, but there are a lot of details to this bill that we could go over if folks would like.
Yeah, I think what I think we could talk about the overall process. And I also just want to be clear that we've been pretty intentional about learning from other states that are going through this, the legislative process and rulemaking as well. And so a lot of the language that we have proposed as a change to the previous session's language is drawn from lessons that have we've learned from other states, right? So, like for example, the compelling public interest piece is based on the fact that we were concerned that language from prior sessions could be used as a loophole because the term public interest or public use is pretty vague. So if in terms of the actual process and the way we're envisioning it, there's still a number of things that need to be figured out in terms of the stressors themselves, which is going to be like the hugest piece of this is identifying which are the most significant environmental and health stressors that we can quantify, because we have to be able to compare them between different geographical areas. So I just want to note that that's like a huge piece that we will not likely figure out in the statute. But in general, the way this would look is once those stressors are identified, the PCA would, upon someone applying for a new facility or another specific circumstances, including some reissuances, they would provide them with a list of here are the adverse stressors that exist in either the EJ area you want to build in, potentially one that you are impacting. That is still to be narrowed down a little bit, but that's roughly correct. Once they get that, if there is a likelihood that they are going to adversely impact those in a disproportionate way, they will have to basically go through an analysis to show how they will avoid doing that. So the defaults in certain circumstances will be like you have to prove that you are not going to exacerbate these stressors. And that's more or less how it's done in New Jersey. The categories ranged there from things like, is there a solid waste facility in the EJ area? Is there a problem with the drinking water in that area? Is there an other educational disparities in that area? And then if that is there, the facility will have to account for how it would impact them. In some cases, that it may be that the stressor itself is not relevant to the facility, and they don't have to say how they would exacerbate it, but they at least have to go through the process of item by item saying this is how we will address these stressors. And then if it's found that they'll have a disproportionate impact on those stressors, well, I think one or more compared to certain baselines, then they would be denied a permit unless there's a finding that it's in a compelling public interest, which is again another term that needs to be defined more. But we're fighting to have it be a very narrow exception. So it should have to be, as Sasha said, something that has a clear benefit for the EJ area itself, and that there's an agreement with between the permittee and the community, showing that the community believes there's a benefit to this facility being there. The other important things to note would be that we are worried about some facilities like the HERC that are probably not going to be technically in an EJ area, but could impact nearby EJ areas. In fact, we know they do. And we need to stop pretending that we don't know they do. I got that was like a very Midwestern flourish with my voice there. I don't know how that happened because I'm from here. But yeah, so we are accounting for that by having a petition process. So folks in a nearby EJ area that's likely to be impacted by certain facilities could petition for a analysis that would have the same practical impacts as the other one we described. So obviously there's like still a lot that needs to be figured out in terms of the substance and the process. I think that the important parts are that we're going to need to have very identifiable stressors and say very clearly if this is a factor in an EJ area or not, and then have a very clear comparison test for that EJ area and either like a statewide baseline or a nearby area, which is New Jersey considers both. These are some of the details that can be worked out in rulemaking. We're trying to have more of them figured out in the statute because statutes are hard to change. Rules are hard to change in different ways. It's really good to have a clear definition in statute, I think, in general, just as like a good practice of writing laws. But so that's the basic process. The real transformative thing is that that new facilities and certain new facilities expansions and certain permitted facilities would have to actually address these things for the first time and address them as an aggregate and not just as individual items where, oh, if you don't emit this much lead in a given year, you pass the standard, right? Like, we know that's not enough to actually determine if a facility is hurting people. We know that these things are intermixed, and so this is like a step in that direction, and it is a big step. Like, we've debated this a lot. You can say, Sasha, like, I mean, we've talked about, is this actually significant enough for us to put our time and effort into? Would this be a substantive change? And I think the pushback you're seeing from folks is not necessarily evidence that it's a substantive change, but it's something, right? Like, it's like, I don't think the chamber would be saying we hate this if they didn't think it would be a problem for their worst members, right? Like, that's how they go about business. So anyway, I'm rambling. Sasha, anything that I missed?
I think we covered a number of different aspects. I'm kind of curious, like Mags or Kathleen or others, like, are there things that we should try and clarify? Because there is a lot of context to how we got to this language and kind of what we're trying to accomplish. So yeah, definitely want to make sure that we are addressing any questions that folks have.
Yeah, I don't know, Kathleen, if you have specifics, or if anyone has specifics that they'd like to see. We have a few minutes before I'm gonna call on Crystal to join the conversation. So if there are any specifics, since we are a small group, that people would love to kind of like hash out. Also, we're gonna have a Q&A at the end of everything. But I don't know, Kathleen, if there's anything that comes up for you or anyone that they could get to right now.
Well, I have a couple of questions. Others might as well. One question I have is, obviously there's a long list of stressors, and it seems like the way MPCA looks at it now, it's based on how many people are living in poverty and how many people are BIPOC. But they don't have, well, what is the pollution people are exposed to, which is the third component that we really need in cumulative impacts, and all the other stuff, because they're community that are victims of environmental racism, say they have all the other stressors. But in terms of actually operationalizing it and evaluating it, I think the pollution component is the most important. Would you agree with that? And do you think MPCA is feeling that as well?
Yeah, and I think, there are a number of ways to kind of approach this whole idea of like what should qualify for like denying a permit here, because one way to phrase it is like, if a facility is going to like exacerbate the cumulative effects of pollution, then it should not get its permits, which is a very like broad term, like way to refer to it, because you could argue that pretty much any additional pollution is going to exacerbate the cumulative effects of pollution because it is an aggregate. Or you could, have an approach that was, kind of like what Tim outlined, where like it is a more specific process that means that not every single facility would get denied like that, which is a roundabout way of saying that, yes, the pollution is like the, very critical part here, in the context of that pollution is really important. And I think we have seen the MPCA like move on that and like recognize that need to address this. I think one of the areas that we've seen them more hesitant to kind of take on is the fact that there are already a lot of sources of pollution in these communities. The language that they have in the governor's budget proposal is specifically about new permits and permit expansions, not permit reissuances. And that's kind of one of the main areas that our language differs, because we all know that there are a lot of sources of pollution in EJ communities that have been impacting their health and social well-being for decades. And so our language would have a much stronger approach to at least beginning to address some of those legacy sources of pollution. So I think that is where there is some level of difference, but I think we all, and even PCA has said that they, acknowledge that there is an issue to address with current sources of pollution. So I think we all can agree that like, we need to address pollution, and pollution is disproportionately impacting, certain communities. But the how and, other bits of context are certainly important there.
Well, I have other questions, but maybe others do too. I don't want to monopolize.
I think to some extent what we're dealing with as a coalition and also as just people who are within the system is that we have to have some baseline for saying here are the demographics that make us want to look much more closely at the cumulative impacts of pollution, knowing that these things tend to disproportionately impact people of color and people who are low income. So I think that there's it's going to be a process to figure out what the right thresholds are and what the process looks like in terms of the details. But I think the way we're envisioning it is like, we know these areas because of those demographic factors are more vulnerable to the cumulative impacts of pollution. So let's identify what those areas are. Let's say that we're not going to add additional stressors into those areas. That might not be the perfect framework, but I think it's at least like a workable framework and one that gives us a chance to also say, okay, so we know that this is where we're calling this an environmental justice area. Let's say that a waste incinerator in itself is a stressor, which it is. That would be a huge change to say you have to consider that as a stressor, as a part of the process of permitting a different project, right? Like it's a sort of reframing of the permitting process in some ways, which I myself sometimes struggle with that, like kind of like reframing how we think about where these stressors interact and where we need to like have much more strong regulations for adding new ones. Yeah, and I think it's tough because whenever you're using demographic data for something like this, it's imperfect, and setting that line is, to me, like the first part of a process. I don't think that any of us are like, this is the black line forever of what defines an EJ area, but we have to start someplace and we have to see if this process works. And then if we need to expand it, I think that would, I don't know anybody in our coalition who would like object if that were a practical thing to do. So yeah.
For sure. Well, I know that people have more questions. It seems like at least Kathleen has some, but I'd love if folks just want to note those down, because we are going to do a full Q&A and take this time just to switch gears, not completely, but a little bit. And I'm going to bring Crystal into the conversation. Crystal's from the Minnesota Environmental Justice Table, and I think can speak to just like, as someone who's working on a campaign that would be impacted by a bill like this, and working in community that would be impacted by a bill like this. So hold questions. We'll do a Q&A after Crystal presents a little bit. And with that, yeah, I'm going to focus in on you, Crystal, and we'd love to hear from you.
Great. Thanks so much, Megs. Yeah, hey, everybody. I know a lot of y'all. Good to see everyone here. Yeah, as far as it's funny, I haven't, as far as the table goes, my colleagues have been very much more in tune with legislative stuff that's been moving, and taking part in a lot of rearranging language, adding language on behalf of a lot of our base members and folks who've been in the fight against the Herc incinerator. And I've been kind of more doing groundwork with those community members, but not as much in the legislation end of things. It's really only been in the past couple of weeks that I've caught up really with kind of the more in-depth analysis and the ways of which all that is going to really impact folks. And so, yeah, I think, especially with the cumulative impacts, but really all of the bills that have been championed that deal with environmental justice. It's really incredible that, thank God we got this trifecta. And of course, it's not the clearest path to, obviously all the things that a lot of us want in the environmental justice fights. But I think in particular, and I'll speak more from the end of the campaign that I know most, with the Herc, shutting down the Herc incinerator fight. These folks are, and I've said this recently actually in a speech that I wrote to talk to the EPNI at an EPNI rally, but speaking on really folks being experts in their own circumstance, and how that gets really lost in legislation at times, or from technocrats, you know, consultants who come in to work on a zero waste plan, to call out the current thing happening with the zero waste plan in the county. You know, there are plenty of consultants and groups who work with community, and then there are those who just come in and come from an end of really working on behalf of their employer, which is the county or corporations, and really the people who put facilities in place and have something to profit. And so, you know, you're dealing with kind of what I have felt like is a war of the experts, right, from all different ends. But some of those people actually work with community, and a lot of these folks, and you know, those people are in this call right now, and have been in the meetings with us with community, are the ones who understand and have been studying and producing those numbers and that research that shows the way that these facilities and environmental justice impacts the health and well-being of these folks. You know, per the incinerator, for example, the physician scientists, engineers for healthy energy came up with this, or did a really wonderful analysis around the Herc incinerator, and findings from data from the county, you know, to really pinpoint the way in which it's one of the largest polluters in the entire in the county, top polluter, and how much money is not just spent on keeping that thing alive, but how much money is spent on the health impacts. Through an analysis they did, they found that between premature deaths, cardiovascular, respiratory, organ, brain damage, asthmatic deaths, all of these things combined from the hundreds of toxins coming out of this thing, there's somewhere between $11 to $24 million in per year in health impacts, right? And similar analyses have been done in other cities and other states around their incinerators, or just folks living in these environmental justice. And I'm speaking specifically to this incinerator, but these are similar numbers with health impacts in environmental justice areas. And one thing that the county typically does, or really from the end of the state, or local, you know, even the local end, is try to pinpoint one particular, and it's just an interesting I don't know, argument to make, but they'll try to pinpoint one specific thing that is doing, or, you know, try to divert and distract from the facilities or what pollutants, and try to really use the idea of ambiguity to be this crutch to not be able to move forward and invest in the things to really address the issues, right? Because if there's no proof, then they put the burden of proof on community or grassroots organizations to show, hey, but where is this pollution coming from though? Because everything you're naming, these toxins could be anywhere. It could be the highways, it could be the shingles factory, it could be, and I think someone, I forgot which legislator said it today, at the state capitol, but the idea is, well, it doesn't really matter because people are dying. And all of it needs to get addressed, right? And actually there is lots of data, and there is plenty of research. We have that by the numbers, not just, you know, locally, but from an international standpoint too, of studies that have done on the direct health impacts of incineration, from anywhere from miscarriages to stomach cancer and headache, fatigue, preterm delivery, lymphoma. There are the studies that show the direct result of incineration impact, right? Not even just the cumulative impact. So in addition to that, you know, yes, obviously, if you have 94 there and a shingles factory, and Superfund sites, then all of these things, including the incinerator, are going to be killing the folks who are living there. And so the idea through these bills is really to address that, and so that you can't keep adding facilities just because you can't say, with, 100% accuracy, this particular facility is causing this particular cancer, right? The idea is it doesn't matter. We know that it's going to cause harm and add to those issues. So, and these community members, you're having them testify, or you're having them, in front of city council, in front of these legislators, saying, we weren't born with this. This isn't, and that's another unfortunate and really nasty thing that legislators like to do, is sort of this implication that, well, folks are kind of just a product of their own doing with their irresponsible eating or their irresponsible lifestyles. And it's effing crazy because as we've seen, it's actually a lot of the circumstances coming out of what they were born into and these environmental issues, right? This impacts their actual well-being and way to be productive, way to work and function. So it's not a chicken or the egg, it's quite simple. There's correlation to why folks are in circumstances they are that have to do with environmental justice. So I'll leave it there. I don't know. Sorry, I wasn't keeping track of time. So if folks, I can keep going, or if anybody has questions.
No, you're all good. That was actually perfect. I wasn't watching either. I would love to just to open it up for questions for anyone who any of these lovely folks who've come to share with us today, for Crystal, for Tim, for Sasha, on the work that they're doing. I'd love, and we can just have this kind of be in discussion mode for a little while. So if folks have questions, you're welcome to use the raise your hand function. You can drop them in the chat, whatever you feel most comfortable with.
So Crystal, I was wondering if you could share that analysis that you talked about. That sounds really powerful. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, I for the cost of health impacts, or that one, great.
I don't know, since we're a small group, do Candace and Rob, do you want to introduce yourselves? I know you did earlier, Rob, and I know Candace because she's from Minnesota Public Health Association.
Thanks, Kathleen. I think people have gotten a lot of information, so I'm appreciative. Thank you.
I really appreciate all the work you all are doing. I'm Rob. I've been studying cumulative impacts of pollution, mainly in Minneapolis, and how it is geographically spread. So this is really, it's just good to hear that we were going to finally get this legislation, and then this science that a lot of people are working on can finally be have some teeth, get some change. That's all I got right now.
Well, I have a health related question. So we know that there are, we know about asthma rates. We know that there was a cancer study comparing North Minneapolis to Northeast. Northeast is majority white and North is majority BIPOC, and have higher rates of cancer, and that people of color have higher rates of cancer. I was wondering, we couldn't put this in the bill, but it appears that there seems to be the need for health monitoring, to bring the health department in and actually look at changes in health over time. I don't know if that would be possible, but it would be helpful.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's something too where we might be able to it would probably require additional work in the legislature, but I think we could address some of that in rulemaking. We really want this process to look a little bit like, okay, so let's say something is undergoing an impacts analysis near you. You are in an EJ area. You should be you should be notified directly. And if for whatever reason it is granted a public use exemption, you should be notified of that too, and of what risks it poses to, because that's not happening right now. So I don't think that addresses the health monitoring question, but I think that's like more on the input side of like what data don't we have that we should have. And I think that's a question that we're going to partly answer by talking about it through rulemaking. But I think we'll also end up realizing what we don't have and should have through that process. And that could be one thing. I mean, it probably will be. We, like others have alluded to, we don't have comprehensive air monitoring data, not even really working air monitoring data right now. And I mean, in my mind, and this is not necessarily like the coalition's take on this, this is kind of forcing the PCA and permittees to figure those things out and to actually explicitly address these things. Like I think about a lot of these things, I hate this term in a lot of ways, but it's useful as like negative externalities of capitalism, right? Like it's the stuff that the cost of the thing is not accounting for, that's being forced on everyone else who's not a part of that transaction. And like, that used to be the consensus, not as like a radical thing that you have to address that if you're a business. And we've just completely, like, that was moderate 40 years ago. That was like Nixon. Well, that's 50 years ago, but you know what I'm saying? Like it's bizarre to me that that's even controversial, because this is really just asking them to go line by line and say, okay, I-94 is next door. How will this not exacerbate the fact that I-94 is next door? Like, how will you actually have a net neutral impact on that existing stressor? That strikes me as an extremely reasonable thing to ask of a new development, knowing what we know about health outcomes, what we know about like climate change. Anyway, I'm getting worked up only because it's like it's such a ridiculous conversation to have, and I'm like happy that we are having it here, but the fact that this is controversial at all as a concept is kind of bizarre.
Yeah, I hear that. Do other folks have questions? I know I can just see, Kathleen, you have like 4 just in your pocket.
Well, the other question that I have is, if the facility is determined to be a benefit to the community and it's allowed, how do you decide who represents the community? Because obviously people have to like get involved and have the capacity to actually get involved and represent the community. So that's a tough one, I think.
Sasha, do you want to take that one? Because I know
The question we've been grappling with for a while.
I'm not dumping it on you, but I'm kind of dumping it on you.
Yeah, no, we've been talking about that for a while, because that is genuinely tricky, especially like what if a community is like split on an issue, and how do you determine like who you should listen to and who you shouldn't listen to? And so I think there's a number of things we're working on there, and a few ideas, and we're also certainly open to other ideas that folks might have of like how to represent community voices in those spaces. I think one of the ways that we are somewhat like in some ways safeguarding against it is it can't just be like a kind of community development agreement. Like it does have to be that there is both compelling public interest and that there's support there. So it goes beyond just like community members saying that they want a thing. We've also talked about like there's the possibility, or we're looking into like the legal possibility of like community organizations or like coalitions that represent community members being able to be part of that process of like signing or agreeing to like a community development or community benefit agreement. Another idea that we have come up with that could be a possibility is we already have like a petition process in other parts of the bill. So like what if a company or like a facility that was trying to get permitted like had to get like a specific number of signatures or like a specific percentage of like the population of a census tract to sign on saying that they want a facility there, because that sets a more clear bar of like what that is. Oh, there's a baby in the Zoom. Which again, I think there's pros and cons to like all of these different approaches, and I don't know if we'll even be able to get to like a perfect solution, but especially when we're trying to uplift like community agency and like the ability for communities to say like what they do or don't want in their communities, like we want to give that power back to them, and let them make those decisions. So that's our best answer at the moment.
Yeah, it's something that like I know Megs, you and I know each other in real life pretty well, and we've talked about a lot. Like it's this question of like how do you actually directly get people involved in these processes and not make it like completely alienating, boring, stressful, like and like no one has the one answer. but I think, I don't know, maybe I hope this isn't me just imposing my own stuff on the coalition, but I'm like, I think we are all pretty like interested in and dedicated to figuring that out and trying new things. And, you know, I'm even thinking like, just really redefining what consultation looks like. Like like getting community involved shouldn't just be holding public hearings, because we know people, for whatever reason, a bunch of good ones, including they're long and stressful, don't show up to them. And like that's, we know this. So why would we keep relying on that as like a proxy for what the community wants? Because it's not one. So I think like there's gonna be opportunity to like try new things out and incorporate lessons from, like, I know that there's been inclusive city planning processes both in the US and outside of it. Like I know there's been attempts at that in Tanzania. There's been attempts at it in, I think there's one, a really interesting one in Seattle. Like these things exist, we can draw from them. It's just that, you know, too often people don't want to do that because it means that you actually have to listen to people that you're not used to listening to. So sorry, rambling on this subject again because it's my favorite. So
No, it's true. I mean, I think that to get people more engaged, we need to have really cute babies in the Zoom. That's, I'm pretty sure, the answer. No, Crystal, please. I see that you put yourself on stack. Please jump in.
No, I appreciate it. Yeah. Yes, definitely food. Yeah, I think, you know, on that, Kathleen, and I just speak on this from kind of the struggle on that. Because I had actually, it's funny you say that a few weeks ago, I was just having a moment speaking to another organizer about the HERC shutdown and getting folks involved in the struggle of that and how there's only so much time in the day. And, you know, if you're a staff of, for example, the EJ table 5, and you have 2 organizers who are kind of doing a lot of groundwork, how many people can you actually get to sign on to something, or that having those conversations with? And that's, I think, just a lot of struggle of a lot of grassroots orgs, a lot of nonprofits, is that staffing and to actually do the real work of building those relationships, because it's not just the canvassing of going up to a door and saying, hey, here's an issue, sign us off. It's most people, a lot of people aren't going to come to the door, and B, even if they do sign it off, that doesn't really mean that you've got someone to sign on to your fight or to your campaign. It's very much someone wants you gone, or is like, whatever, I have to get back to my life. And so I think this country is especially difficult and unique in its difficulty because of that really the diversity and the unique kind of the folks here that are most marginalized have either had an ongoing genocide committed on them from, you know, the moment colonization took part here, or you had another group of folks who were extracted from their lands and pitted here. And so I think other countries where you see a lot of organizing and protesting and kind of an easier access through organizing, a lot of that is too because like there's a kind of more monolith in ethnicity or likeness in culture. And here there's just so many different cultures and people struggling with so many different kinds of struggles, even if it's, you know, one the same struggle. But folks have different interests, and this country has just done such a great job of creating the stratification that too, when you're organizing as a group, you have to account for so many different things. And again, you know, people do not trust anyone, right? Especially in the groups that we're trying to access. Folks just don't have that trust, and it doesn't matter if you look like them either, right? They're like, who do you work for? And so that's, you know, just a big thing that I think, yeah, as everything that Tim and Sasha were naming, we're figuring it out. And you have to also just trust that as long as you are trying and building those relationships and constantly in communication with different groups, and, you know, talking to their leaders who are typically, you know, faith leaders or schools, that you know, you're getting as much as you can and to keep moving that way. But yeah, we really need to build capacity, I think, in our movements with having folks actually reaching out, doing that door knocking, going to the schools, going to the churches, the mosques, etc. But yeah, it's I think a lot of it is capacity too to do that. But you're not going to get everyone to sign on either. You know, I think that's we've seen that problem happen in a lot of these areas through a lot of different fights where folks are making this false assumption of like, oh, well, this is a monolith who probably all agree on this issue. And then you see some serious interfighting. So
Yeah, agreed. Yes, thank you for saying that. I couldn't agree more. Yeah. Do folks have other questions, comments, things you wanna?
I have another one. So obviously, I'm sorry. Has this been fully implemented in New Jersey? And no, it hasn't. Okay, so we don't know
No, I think
viability or anything.
last I checked, they are. I think they've published their final rules, but have not. They've been published. I'm not sure if the comment period has ended or not, to be honest. So we haven't really seen it work in practice yet. Although you could argue that the law that applies to East Phillips was kind of a pilot of this. So that's something we can draw lessons from as well. I think that we looked at both that and New Jersey, less so at the New York process, but that's something that we can continue to look at when we go into rulemaking. But yeah, short answer is no, but there are still existing lessons we can draw from, of course.
Well, that relates to other question that I have is accountability. So obviously the MPCA isn't doing a very good job in Phillips because they were going to allow the new facility and not the garden. So, I mean, that's, yeah, that's going to be important in the rulemaking.
It's going to be important in the rulemaking and also in, making sure that we have the strongest language possible, because there is a question of, you look at the permits that are required for what EPNI is proposing and also what the city's proposing. And like, those are different sets of permits, even though they affect the same area in the same way, really. So it's like, it's this sort of, there's still a, I would say, misuse of the permitting process and of technocracy by like government actors and private actors. This isn't going to fully address that, but I think that at least gives us like more intervention points, which is really useful in environmental law, because it's one of the few places where like people can just sue on behalf of the environment. Like that's so rare in the broader stretch of the legal system here. But yeah, I think there's a bigger problem with like the power dynamics there, right? Which is just like right now, when the city of Minneapolis wants to put a vehicle depot someplace, it can bully its way into it. So regardless of whether or not this moves forward, we're going to need like to build power in strategic places and also like change the assumptions about why we build things and where, and like what's necessary and what's essential. Because I think right now a lot of people's assumptions, their conclusions are a little bit like silly or bad. I don't know how to put it other than that. Just just people with some bad brain ideas right now. We got to change those.
Bad brain ideas. And on that note, no, I'm just kidding.
You can tell I'm a little bit tired because I'm starting to say things like bad brain ideas, which I legitimately.
Only because I've known Tim for a minute do I feel like I can make fun of him in the Zoom.
Oh yeah,
presentation. I have a couple of things, but I just wanted that I'll save for the end. But yeah, if there's any last questions, this is the last call. Yeah, please, Rob, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, little thoughts popping in my head all the time. But I guess my biggest question is, so I was just reading over like the bill language, and it says that census tracts are going to be used. And I was just wondering, what's the kind of because they're kind of big sometimes, I guess. So what was the reason behind that?
As I recall, the simplest reason is just that it was easier to find clear demographic data associated with those census tracts. And so we had the existing data set, and we were running into a problem with both the PCA and to some extent the Department of Health, where they're like, we can't get that data, or we don't have that data. So the most we can say, like, we know you have that data, and we there's a map you have that shows you have that data. It like kind of like avoids that problem. There's still the issue, like you said, of like, is this too big to be considered a neighborhood? how are we comparing those census tracts? Like New Jersey has this interesting system where they set like statewide averages, like 50th percentile, and then they also set have a system for like comparing an EJ area to a like geographically close but demographically dissimilar area, so that we're not like burdening one tract in a county, for example. So like there's going to be a bigger question of how we actually compare these things, and like that this is not my area of expertise. I like thinking about rules and stuff, but also I get a little bit like yeah, we're gonna have to talk more about it, like, and think through what this process should look like, because we do have an opportunity to like define it as throughout this process. We have an opportunity to define this process, the process we're talking about, throughout this process, which is the one we're doing right now in the legislature.
Well, my one note is a lot of people that study like urban areas use census block groups, which are like the next size down, and because it's just more accurate, like, or it's a little
That makes
smaller.
sense. Okay.
Like in urban areas at least. But yeah, for sure, and it's a big issue in like what I study, and like, yeah.
No, that's good to know. No, and that's something we hadn't considered, only because it was just like the standard that we had been working with. That's something we might be able to address in rulemaking, though. I have to think about that, but like I don't think that the definition in statute is going to be like the final level of detail that'll be applied to this, right? It's just a question of like the starting off point. But yeah, Sasha, we'll bring that to the coalition. That's a really good point, and like it would make it more powerful if we could get a little bit more specific in where this law impacts folks.
And even like doing, sorry, I just ideas. But
no, I like
yeah,
it. It's great.
Using like census block groups and then all adjacent to an EJ area would be maybe better than just big census tracts. Like, I don't know, just the thought.
No, it's great.
But yeah, all these demographics I'm pretty sure are at the census block level. Census block group. So that's my 2 cents. But yeah,
no, that's great to know. And yeah, like there's also a chance that, I mean, we'll have to talk about it more, because it might be too late to make that change this session. But also, if it doesn't pass this session, like we can take these ideas and improve it for next session. Like there'll be opportunities to integrate more of these ideas going. Like I think that's like, don't apologize, because we are hearing things all the time. We're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. This is a process. We have to like incorporate more things. So like, yeah, that's a really, really, like, I'm gonna bring that back to the coalition and we'll talk about it for sure.
Cool,
Awesome.
cool. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I do want to respect folks' time. So if people want to stay and chat after this, but I would just love, especially since we're going to be sharing this recording out with our members, if I could one last time first put Crystal on the spot, and then Sasha and Tim, just if there's anything that you want to share with folks that will be good to know about the Herc fight, any places people can plug in, or if you want to drop any links, anything like that. Just what does they say on the podcast? Plug your pluggables. So yeah, Crystal, if you want to talk about that a little bit, and then we can go on to the bill.
Yeah, definitely. I think, well, right now, it's a pretty crucial time because the zero waste plan, the county is asking for commentary on that, and the last date is the 20th. 6 more days, and so we're really pushing folks to comment on that zero waste plan to get a shutdown date for the Herc incinerator and a phase out plan. And we're trying to work with the county and work with zero waste experts to implement that and have a just transition. But certainly commenting on that to ask for a Herc shutdown date. And then in addition to that, we have a petition going that we need signatures on, and because petitions matter. And so we're trying to get to 10,000 signatures. And so we have that in motion right now. We thought the county was going to vote, or the commissioners were going to vote on the zero waste plan. Apparently they're not. So it's really, yeah, leaves things in the air. But we want this plan to really incorporate that. So I will drop a link for the petition and the zero waste commentary by the county. And thank you guys.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for all that work, and thanks for sharing that. And we can also in our follow-up get that out to all our folks. And then, yeah, if Sasha and or Tim, what can people do? Who can they call to support this bill?
Yeah, I mean, it looks like Alex already put something in the chat, but contacting your legislator is always helpful. I mean, we already know that there are a number who are like super supportive, but really just reminding them, or if your legislator has not been involved yet, telling them that this is a priority for you. Legislators do care more about their constituents than some people realize. I think kind of some legislators who aren't even meeting with anyone that's not their constituent this session. So contacting your legislators can be really powerful there. We also are going to have another hearing in the Senate Environmental Committee, so stay posted for that. I'm sure we'll be sharing it on social media and action alerts and things like that. And getting folks to show up for that is always helpful as well. And we may be doing some more broader actions or ways to show support, especially in April when we're really trying to build momentum going into the end of session to make sure that this language remains in the omnibus bill and that it stays strong.
I only have, I think, 2 more things to add. One of which is we meet every Thursday at 12:30, and we want more folks to attend those meetings. They're very open. We talk about like our strategy and communications, things like that. I think you can probably just include my email when this goes out, and folks can email me and just let me know if they want to be looped in. And then also, I think in general, like when thinking through some of these, how do we make actual community-driven planning and regulation happen? Like, talk to your neighbors about this stuff. See if they're experiencing the things we're talking about. It's hard. Like, I did a little bit of organizing with my neighbors during the pandemic because I was freaked out, but it was still like really good and really useful. I think, like Crystal alluded to, like we're a very alienated country for a bunch of reasons, and it's hard to talk to people, and it gets exhausting. But also, it's like that's what we've got. We've got each other. So I'll leave us on that very Pollyanna-ish note, I guess.
How unlike you, Tim. No, that's great. Well, I want to thank everyone so much for coming, and I know we ended up with a much smaller group than we expected, but it'll be great to have this information for anyone who wants to go to our YouTube, really, but also we'll send it out to our members so that people can stay up to date in their busy lives. So yeah, thank you so much to Sasha and Tim and Crystal for coming and presenting this information. Really appreciate it. Thanks everyone for coming, and yeah, really appreciate your work and look forward to working with you more in the future. And everyone have a lovely evening. It's still a little light out.
So much.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
So
Bye-bye.